Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as they've looked into the topic of political polarization and can talk intelligently about it. We want to present their perspective to you unedited and unaltered. With us today, it's our privilege to have John D. Graham. He's a professor at Indiana University at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. 1 second here. Let me check something real quick. Okay. And I want to start it off by saying this is an email I got from him where he says, warning, there are no easy solutions to partisan polarization. I just want to part that off. So he is a postdoctorate fellow, 1984, environmental science, public policy, Harvard School of Public Health. He has a PhD in urban and public affairs, Heinz School, Carnegie Mellon University. He has a master's in public affairs from Duke University and a Bachelor of Honors in Economics and Politics from Wake Forest University. He's also served as a professor of risk and policy analysis with tenure at Indiana University, also a professor of policy analysis at Pardee Rand Graduate School, professor of policy and decision sciences at the Harvard School of Public Health, also another appointment at Harvard School of Public Health, and finally, assistant professor, School of Urban and Public Affairs, Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's also been a member, board of directors, R Street Institute, Washington, D.C., expert witness on intellectual property and electric vehicles, consultant, Auto Innovative Alliance, Washington, D.C., a member, Committee of Radiological Protection, a chair on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Chartered Science Advisory Board, and also a co-chair on the Committee on the Role of Affordability under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Currently, he's the dean of the School of Public Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington, Indiana. And this is the research where I found the professor. But before we get into that, let's check in. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct about your background, Professor?
It's all right, except I stepped down as dean in 2019. I'm now back on the faculty.
Okay. Stepped down as dean in 2019. So that rhymes. So let's get right into the meat and potatoes. You were saying there's not an easy solution to political polarization. Before we address that, what is this report, Polarized Politics and Policy Consequences, obviously done for the world famous Rand Corporation? What was this report? Why did you write it? Why did you think it was a good report to be part of?
Well, this is a report that we did to try to understand what should we expect in terms of public policy changes in light of the fact that our politics is becoming increasingly polarized on both party and ideological lines.
Okay. And roughly when did you do this study?
Wow, I'm going to guess it's back in 2007.
Okay. Did you notice or believe that political polarization was a serious problem in 2007?
Yes, in fact, there is some interesting debate in the literature about when the most recent bout of partisan polarization began. I think there's a general consensus that it was somewhere around the early 1990s. Mm-hmm. Some people point to the Gingrich Revolution and how the contract with America changed our politics. Some people go even earlier and look at the polarization around the confirmation hearings of Robert Bork as a Supreme Court justice. But in any event, I just wanted to emphasize, however, that we've had previous bouts of partisan polarization in American politics, going all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. So this thing sort of comes and goes.
What was going on in I've heard the theory that 1990s was when they started with Gingrich's reforms, which were not good for Congress being able to work together. What was going on in 2007 where you thought this was a polarizing time? Because a lot of people go to, oh, Donald Trump. You know, that's when it really kicked off. What's going on in 2007? Why is 2007? What are you seeing in 2007 that leads to you believe this is an issue around that time?
Well, I should disclose that I actually worked in the White House of President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2006, and so I experienced partisan polarization while I was working for President Bush, and that motivated me in part to do the writing I did when I left the Bush administration to go be the dean at the Rand Graduate School. So that's a little bit of context, but I do vividly remember that when I was working for President Bush, he would oftentimes lament that, oh, I just want to find a Democratic member of the Senate or the House who I can work with on this issue, because he loved to do collaboration with people from the other party. But it was very hard to find people who were willing to do that, because it was not always in their political interests to be seen as collaborating with the president from the other party.
I had done some reading that said when Bush got in, there was already a Democratic push to not work with him on a variety of issues, especially in the aftermath of the Iraq War. So yeah, that's interesting. And so you were in the White House, 2001
Yes.
to 2006,
Right.
and you are seeing political polarization, and you are hearing from the President of America himself lamenting the degree of polarization. Is that correct?
Yes, and I want to remind you that early in President Bush's tenure, he did have some successes that were bipartisan.
Mhm.
He was able to work with Ted Kennedy and with Joe Lieberman, Democrats in the Senate, on his No Child Left Behind education bill. And he was able to work with Max Baucus, the Democratic senator of Montana, on a new prescription drug benefit for outpatient prescription drugs. But as you mentioned, once we got bogged down in the wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, and the polarization intensified, I think for the rest of his presidency, he found it very difficult to collaborate. And of course, that's been replicated by subsequent presidents. Now, another key part of the history we have to remember here, too, is President Obama had to face the emergence of the Tea Party. And the Tea Party also made it extremely difficult for any Republican to collaborate with President Obama. So it wasn't just the Democrats wouldn't collaborate with President Bush, it was also the Republicans wouldn't collaborate with President Obama.
Does that seem like a sign of government stability to go from one administration? This guy gets elected, the opposition party says, well, we're going to shut everything down. Then that party gets someone elected, and then the other opposition party says, well, we're going to shut down everything you say.
Yes. Now, one thing to remember, what's going on here is there's a certain fraction of American voters who they really like presidents who get things done. And they don't necessarily have that strong of opinion on the issues, but they feel it's important that the president be doing things. And as a consequence, presidents get political benefit from bipartisan legislation. And the other party has begun to realize this. And they do their best, particularly the leadership of the opposing party in Congress, they do their best to deprive a president of those bipartisan victories.
Right. I want to get to the solutions, but first I got to ask you the section on negative consequences. Among the negative consequences of polarization, legislative gridlock is one that is most commonly mentioned that has received considerable study. The so-called gridlock hypothesis asserts that polarization is a contributing factor to increased gridlock. Gridlock has been defined, blah, blah, blah. Using this measure, it appears that gridlock rose between 1940 and 1990s. Additionally, you also mention another key aspect of gridlock hypothesis is the rapidly diminishing number of centrists in the House and the Senate. You had mentioned before, yes, we've had periods of polarization. Is this period of polarization we're going through now bad? Is it significantly bad? Can we say that? Or can we just say, hey, we lived through the Civil War, we lived through the 1960s, we have good times, we have bad times. Nothing to be worried about, people. Just go home and live your lives. Which one seems more appropriate to somebody studying political situations here in America today?
Well, let me start by saying that this period of polarization is different from virtually all of the other previous periods of polarization. And the ways in which it's different are that the previous bouts tended to revolve around one dominant issue: war or peace, tariffs, civil rights. Now, what's different about the current bout about polarization, and the political scientists have a fancy word for this, they call it conflict extension. And what that means is that the two parties have become polarized on numerous issues rather than one dominant issue. So you'll see in Congress party line voting on, federal spending, abortion, war and peace, environment, all these various issues. So one of the reasons I do believe it's a troubling period in our politics is it's very difficult to make progress on issues when you have this conflict extension.
So we did have polarization in the past, and it was bad and not good. However, maybe not getting into if this is worse or yet, but this is definitely different. And one of the things that you find troubling is that in the past, we might be polarized on a issue, the Vietnam War, the Civil War. Now we're polarized on 20 to 30 different issues into two separate blocks. Is that a fair summary?
That's right.
Conflict extension. And so it is bad, and it is preventing Congress from operating well. Let me go to the red meat of this interview, and we're going to get into the solutions here in detail. But why did you say there are no easy solutions to partisan polarization? What did you mean by that, and why say that?
Well, I think that when we discuss a problem in our politics, it's very natural for people to say, well, what's the fix? Well, the reason there isn't any easy fix is because the root causes of polarization are multiple, and they relate to very profound changes in our country that have caused our political parties to behave differently than they used to. And it's not easy to sort of unwind that process. I'll give you one very concrete example.
Please.
The South used to be represented primarily by Democrats. And they were a moderate and conservative influence in the Democratic Party. A lot of people, including my students who I'm teaching today, they don't realize that New England used to be a hotbed of Republican strength.
Right.
And Republicans in New England were a more moderate, in some cases liberal, think Nelson Rockefeller or John Heinz from Pennsylvania, and they were a moderating influence in the Republican Party. So what has happened in the last 50 years since the Nixon presidency is the South has gradually, particularly white voters in the South, have gravitated to the Republican Party, and that has made the Conservative Party even more conservative. And then New England has gravitated toward the Democratic Party, making the more liberal party even more liberal. And it's not easy to unwind this kind of thing. So this is a pretty gradual but steady and powerful change in our country.
I think what you're referring to is called sorting. I've seen professors mention that you used to have people across America, they were Democrat or Republican, and now you have this whole state is mostly Republican. Almost everybody votes this way. All the liberals have either left or they're quiet. Other conservatives have moved into that state, making it super conservative and very not liberal, and they vote a certain way every election on every single issue. And this is a pattern that's been developing since the 1970s, or maybe since the 1990s, at least, where people are sorting into two separate, clean ideological camps. Is that a fair summary?
Yep.
So the sorting. And when you say, hey, it's not going to be easy to undo the sorting, I think what you're getting at, please correct me if I'm wrong. That's why we do the show. I love being corrected. I want to learn is people have been sorting for 3 decades or since the 1990s, 40 years. You're not going to undo that in a year or two, and you're not going to do that with a simple rule change. Like, hey, can you 100 million Americans move back to where you used to come from, or just be more open to the other side? This is a psychological and geographic shift that's taken decades to get to, and only generational change can undo it. Is that fair?
Yes, it says it's probably going to have to be gradual in order to turn it around. It's not going to. There's not going to be one simple little institutional reform like getting rid of the electoral college or something like that, and all of a sudden we'll be back to where we were before.
So there isn't a simple fix that'll put Humpty Dumpty's back together with all the King's men?
Nope. But I did notice when I worked for President Bush that he had a couple strategies that he used that he had a modest amount of success with, and they're probably worth mentioning.
Please.
So one thing the president can do is they can look at the senators and members of Congress from the opposing party, but who represent competitive districts or states. Think Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Colorado, Nevada. And then when he's looking for collaboration with a person from the opposing party, he can identify some of the representatives from those competitive states and districts, and then get on the airplane and fly to the capital city and have a press conference and say, hey, I'm President of the United States, and I would really like to reach out to Senator Baucus here from Montana because I feel he's a reasonable person and I'd like to work with him on these issues.
Clever.
So he bypasses the national media completely and just goes directly into the local media. And at the same time, of course, the White House Legislative Affairs staff are reaching out to Senator Baucus's office, alerting him that they're going to be coming to his state. They don't want to embarrass him, but they want them to know that, by the way, we're going to let your constituents know that the president wants to work with you.
Oh, clever.
And this worked this is on the Medicare prescription drug benefit. It worked nicely. Yep. Worked on energy policy, which was passed in 2005. There were 10 Democratic senators in the Midwest who supported the president on energy policy. But I'm not trying to say that this is a panacea. I'm saying he had some modest success with this as kind of a tactic.
I will totally back that up. Bush did some very bipartisan things coming in, and he made it clear that he wanted to be bipartisan. And a lot of the research that I've done on political polarization, they talk about how Bush was deeply saddened that he was not able to do bipartisan work towards the end of his second term that he had done early on. And he comes across as a figure who might have been polarizing himself as a personality, but who never wanted to push polarization, and as a president was always trying to pull people together. Is that fair?
I mean, I'm obviously
push back.
I'm very biased toward President Bush because I worked with him, got to know him well, and I like him. But I think it's more complicated than that because I think you look at the political strategy that President Bush exerted on behalf of Republicans in the midterm elections and in his re-election campaign with the advice of Karl Rove, who was his political advisor. In many cases, Karl Rove was a great believer that the way that George W. Bush had to win elections is he had to focus on turning out his base.
Right.
That if there weren't enough undecided people in the middle that you could try to persuade to come your way, you had to really energize. And as a consequence, President Bush had a variety of initiatives that were quite divisive, but were designed to generate enthusiasm from his base. So I think it's a complicated story. I don't think it's... obviously, President Bush wishes he would have had more bipartisan legislative victories, so forth and so on. But President Bush also knows that he played the partisan card aggressively, both to get himself reelected and to get Republican members of the House and Senate.
And so even when he was running, Karl Rove, Bush's brain, his campaign manager, was saying, we got to focus on the base. There's just not enough undecided voters out there.
Right.
Okay.
Karl Rove has written a lot about this. He's been very articulate about it, explaining why. Because the old view of politics was that there's 30% people who are liberal, 30% are conservative, there's 30% in the middle, and everybody's fighting over the people in the middle.
Right.
Rove did not agree with that.
And his strategy, while controversial, got Bush a win, repeated wins. And I've read some stuff where they said that Barack Obama's campaigns did the same thing, where they didn't publicize it, but they said our strategy is to focus on the base. It's not to get undecided voters. So that would be like Bush going right into Obama, where their advisors are saying the game's changed. It's not like you said in the old school where there's a third of the population that's undecided. There are no undecided voters, or there's not enough of them. Your best strategy is really not to try to reach out to voters who don't like you already, but just to focus on voters who already do.
Obviously, Obama was extremely effective with young people, with people of color, and energizing them to vote, and it just overwhelmed Romney and McCain.
And we're going to get to the we're going to get to the strategies, but I have to say something. As a Latino, we hear a lot, and this is I'm not going to digress, but I'll just say this briefly. There's a lot of theory that all Latin people are liberals. That's not true. I'm here in California, and I might be more liberal, but I have family in Texas, and they're Mexican too, and they're just as conservative. And George W. Bush did outstanding at reaching out to Latino voters. I think it was damn near close to 50-50. He really put that on the margin that Latin voters can be reached out to by Republicans or Democrats. And so I just wanted to comment that he was quite excellent at trying to reach out to that group and make them feel included.
Well, you may remember that President Bush really wanted, in his second term, he wanted to do a comprehensive immigration reform package. And he had very strong support from the Hispanic community, and he worked with some of the Democrats, but it was the Republicans in the House of Representatives who shut him down. He couldn't get his own party to back it. So I think you also have to remember that George W. Bush was a former governor of Texas. He had developed a very strong relationship with the Hispanic community long before he came into the White House. Yeah. So, I worked on a couple of issues where it was made very clear that this is part of our constituency. And a lot of people my students don't understand that. They think, oh, these Hispanics, they're all Democrats. And that, as you say, it's just really not true. Not true. And it's an opportunity for the Republicans if they choose to do it. But then there's a whole other wing of the Republican Party that would prefer to spend the time galvanizing their traditional white voter base.
Yep. I've noticed that. I hope diversity wins out. Also, there was Mayra Flores out of Texas, who was a conservative. And when she won, boy, the Democrats were mad because it defeated their narrative that all Latinos and all Texas Latinos were going to become Democrat. Mayra Flores was very conservative and won. And it was so bad that when Nancy Pelosi took a photo with her, Mayra Flores' daughter was standing next to Nancy Pelosi, and Nancy Pelosi pushed that little Latino girl out of the picture physically with her hand. And you could see the level of anger. I'm not making this up. It's on video. You could see the level of disgust Nancy Pelosi had for how dare you be a Latin person and not be a Democrat, right? So you can watch that video, come to your own conclusions, but it was definitely there. She absolutely did push a little girl out of the picture. That was called racism in the 1990s, but she got a total pass in America. I'll leave it to you to figure that out on your own. Let's go to solutions. Polarized politics and policy consequences. Solutions to curtail polarization. A casual connection may exist between polarization of ordinary Americans and polarization of the political elites, but the direction of this relationship is far from obvious. Polarization is likely a combination of bottom-up divergence of preference in society and top-down signaling by the political elites. If we decide that we want to reduce polarization, the solutions may require measures aimed at both elites and the lay public. Professor, this sounds like it's getting to what you said earlier. There's not a quick little simple vote that we can have to fix this. The people are part of the problem, and any solution will require the people.
Yes, in fact, there used to be a point of view in political science that really it's only the elites that are polarized.
Right.
The activists in the Democratic and Republican Party who are polarized, and ordinary people are all pretty practical and moderate and so forth and so on. But I think that a fair body of evidence has been developed over the last 20 years that shows that the American voters themselves have become more dogmatic, more difficult to persuade to support candidates from the other party or policy initiatives that were sponsored by the other party. So we've got problems at the ordinary voter level, not just at the elites.
I had seen this debate, I think, between Morris Fiorina and Abramowitz, and I found it largely confusing because they were only the elites are polarized. No, the people are polarized. And I like what you're saying is that maybe at some time in the past, maybe the 1970s, maybe the 1990s, it was just the elites. But come on, we're talking about January 6th. We're talking about 22 cities on fire with BLM. We're talking about Hillary Clinton denying the election and spreading lies about Trump. And then we're also talking about Trump denying the election for Biden. That's the people, right? I mean, that's not just the elites. Or is it, how do you stand on this debate between the elites or the people?
Well, I think that it's well documented that if you look at the ideological profiles of party activists in both the Republican and Democratic Party, they are more doctrinaire than the average registered Democrat or average registered Republican. So no question about it. This is why in the primaries, it's very difficult for the more moderate candidates to win in the primaries, because the primaries are dominated by these very doctrinaire voters, except in states that allow independent voters to vote in the primary. So you look at this New Hampshire primary coming up. My guess is you're going to see Nikki Haley do a lot better there than she does in Iowa, where the caucuses are really oriented toward the party, Republican Party activists. Mm. So that's one minor kind of peek at a possible solution is allowing at least independents to vote in these primaries of either party. And then there are some states that I think allow anybody to vote in either primary. I don't think that's very common, but I think there are some that allow that. Anything that moves in that direction will give the more moderate candidates a chance to win primaries and get the nomination.
Okay, let's get to the meat and potatoes. The solutions to political polarization are more centrists in Congress, reform primary process to encourage moderate candidates, and have competitive congressional districts. Another solution is a more deliberative process, change congressional voting procedures, create more bipartisan commissions. Another one is increase citizen participation. And finally, reward balanced media coverage. Let's just go one by one. What is, I know you already said this, but more centrist in Congress, how is that going to solve the problem? And what are the pitfalls to this being a silver bullet?
Well, there are a lot of pitfalls to it because, it's interesting. A lot of members of Congress who by their own policy preferences are moderate. They don't necessarily vote moderate. They tend to vote very conservative or very liberal because they're worried about their re-election in the primary, not the general election, but they're worried about somebody running against them on their flank. And there's some really interesting research that's been done that shows that if you're an incumbent member of Congress in the House or Senate and you're defeated for re-election, if you're defeated by a candidate from the other party, your political career may still survive, and you may actually come back and be able to recapture that seat at some point in the future or another major seat. But if you are defeated by a member of your own party from your flank, it's usually a death knell for your career as a politician. And this causes politicians to assiduously guard their voting record and make sure they're not vulnerable from their flank.
Yeah. What about competitive?
A good example of that was when President Obama he was trying to get his health care package passed, and he wasn't expecting that, dozens of Republicans were going to line up and support him. But, he actually invited all these members of Congress from the Republicans from the House and Senate to come to the Jackson Place and talk through health care and give them some ideas. And they could add some of those ideas into the health care bill. And he was hoping he'd get maybe, five Republicans or something. The Tea Party made it very clear to any Republican who collaborated with President Obama, they would run a Tea Party candidate against him at the next election in the primary.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And they were very effective at changing the Republican Party and introducing a philosophy of we don't necessarily need to pass laws as long as we make sure that Obama can't get anything passed. That's success enough. That seemed to be somewhat new politically, but they did pioneer and popularize that strategy. What about competitive congressional districts? How do we reform competitive congressional districts, and how would that fix everything? And what are the pitfalls to that?
Well, let's start by saying part of the problem is that there's a conspiracy of the Republican and Democratic parties not to want to have competitive districts. Because if they can carve up, say in a particular state, if they can agree to carve up, you get these districts, you get these districts, then that reduces the cost of campaigning immensely. And then they can focus their resources on the relatively few that are competitive. So you do have a very serious problem that you've got too many congressional districts that the way they're drawn, they're really not winnable by a candidate from one of the parties. So at the margin, there is some help that would be provided through reform in the way districts are drawn, which would have, if they're drawn in a way that actually allows more diversity within each district. But I think we have to remember that even though there are a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about redistricting reforms and so forth, the United States Senate is also extremely polarized now. It's not just the House of Representatives.
Thank you.
And the Senate has become just as polarized at the same time that the House has. It actually started, I think, in the House, and then it spilled over into the Senate. So it's not obvious that the way that districts are drawn in the House is a powerful variable. It's probably just at the margins.
I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, I'd heard that. A lot of people said redistricting. And then when I was doing reading, they go, well, explain the Senate. Can't redistrict the Senate. It's the state boundaries. So how are they polarizing at the same level of the House? That's fascinating. And then also what you're pointing out is if people in Congress are there because of these safe districts, why would they want to get rid of that? I mean, they have people in power, and it's easier for them to spend limited resources on safe districts rather than actually have to compete. Right.
That's the same reason why big companies like to merge and get more market share. It's the old antitrust problem, no competition.
And finally, we have, even if you got moderates in Congress, they don't vote moderate because they're worried about being primaried.
Right. So it's just not a function of the belief systems of these candidates. It's their incentives for how they vote. And you have to be able to change the incentives. It's not just changing the people.
It's fascinating. A more deliberative process. If polarization is damaging to meaningful debate, then a solution might be to encourage a more deliberative process in Congress. Change congressional voting procedures. Encourage more open rules and fewer filibusters on policy matters. Introduce institutional mechanisms to expand the time allotted for formal deliberation and create more bipartisan commissions. Tell me, how is this a solution, and what are the pitfalls to this solution?
Well, let's take the filibuster, for example. A lot of people, that debate has been framed as either we retain the filibuster or we eliminate the filibuster. But if you look back at the history, it used to take 67 votes to invoke cloture and stop a filibuster in the Senate. That was then reduced to 60 votes. And it seems to me, given the way our politics now is, I don't think it's likely we're going to eliminate it entirely on legislation, but it wouldn't be a terrible idea to reduce it to, say, 55 or 57 until we get less polarization in our voting patterns. And that's sort of the middle ground nobody wants to talk about, because it's such a fun issue to have kind of, strident debates about. But there's nothing magic about 60 votes.
And so the House or the Senate may come up with a law. The House typically will approve laws. The Senate's more difficult to get something through. If we make the filibuster smaller, then there's a more likelihood of different bills being passed by the Senate and legislation being enacted. Is that the idea?
Right. So the demand of getting votes from the opposite party is not eliminated, but it's not quite as large as it has been historically.
What is the pitfall to putting our faith into removal of the filibuster or changes to the filibuster solving all of our problems?
Well, I think what it does, if you don't change the underlying factors that are causing the polarization, then they'll just put more resources into frightening the people who might vote with the other side. So it'll just intensify the efforts to keep people along.
Oh, okay. So even if it is easier to pass legislation, they'll just focus on scaring people away from signing that legislation.
Even more than they are now. Yeah.
What about, I'd heard this one criticism of the filibuster that, let's say you got rid of the filibuster, simple majority in the Senate, good enough to get laws passed. And so when the Democrats come in and they control the House and the Senate, they could get most of their laws passed. And when the Republicans come in and they sweep the House and the Senate, they could get most of their laws passed. And so that would allow us to have a party comes to power and they're actually able to enact legislation, what the public wants. That's why they put them in. One of the critiques I've heard is that there's a country called Argentina. And they have a government where one side gets in with 51% of the vote and then says, we're going to undo every law passed by the other party and do the total opposite. And then you have to deal with that for 4 years. And then the other party gets in and they go, we're going to undo all of that. And so you have these wild policy swings from one administration to the other, which is horrible for business and the public, because any administration that comes in can basically get whatever laws that they want passed. And because they're so polarized, they constantly attack each other with that. That wouldn't be good for American democracy to have such drastic, wild policy swings like the country of Argentina, correct?
Right. And we already have this ping-ponging going on with rulemakings and regulation, which don't require acts by Congress. So you get one president comes in and they issue all these regulations, and the next administration comes in and then they try to repeal or redo all these regulations done by the previous president. So we're already observing the ping-ponging happening in executive action. So why would we want to recreate that same dynamic with legislation? One illustration of how useful it's been that there is a filibuster is that for people who believe that the Affordable Care Act did some good things to expand health insurance for people, really the thing that ultimately protected the Affordable Care Act was the fact that they could not repeal it entirely without 60 votes. There were efforts to repeal parts of it in budget reconciliation, which doesn't require 60 votes. And McCain and Susan Collins are a couple of Republicans who blocked that. But it's very important in the history of the success of the Affordable Care Act that we had a filibuster.
Interesting. Great point. And I liked how you brought up, we already have ping-ponging in executive actions by the president. So famously, DACA. President Barack Obama said, hey, if you're undocumented, register your name on this list and we'll make sure you can stay here legally to get an education. Then Donald Trump became president and he said, Thank you for registering that list. I'm now going to use that to round all of you up. And the amount of fear and trepidation in the Latin community from going from one president to the other was extreme. Entire communities disappeared overnight out of fear. Why expand that to the House? We've already seen that kind of ping-ponging, as you're saying. Not good. Let me ask you about increased citizen participation. If we just increase citizen participation, that'll work. There remains a large segment of American population that does not participate in politics at all. Measures to improve voter turnout may in primary elections would likely prevent strong partisans from exerting disproportionate influence on candidate selection. Possible mechanisms for increasing voter turnout include allowing registration on election day, electronic voting, holding elections on Sunday, etc., federal holiday. U.S. demographic trends may work naturally to alleviate polarization. For example, Latinos are one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the country, but traditionally have had low rates of voter turnout. Greater Latino participation will likely cause both parties to reconsider positions and possibly move to the center on some issues. Tell us about increased citizen participation. How do we increase citizen participation to get people to vote more? And what are the pitfalls that may not work as a magic bullet?
Well, I think the key question is whether or not the increased citizen participation, does it come from the tails of the ideological spectrum? Or does it come from voters that are more centrist and who are more interested in having politicians collaborate with politicians from across party lines? The parties and the campaigns tend to have an incentive to increase participation among people in the tails because they know exactly how they're going to vote, and every dollar they spend going after them is a return in terms of trying to get more votes for their side. So the question then becomes, well, who's going to spend all the money and effort to get these people in the middle? A lot of them, frankly, who are disaffected from politics and aren't that active and don't vote that much. Who's going to spend the money to get those people? And that's not so obvious. That's a pitfall.
Interesting. So why focus on moderates or the middle? I could try my best to convince them. I'm still not sure. If I just focus on my base, I know for a fact that if I get my base to vote, I know how they're going to vote. If I focus on moderates, it's a gamble. So why would I spend my time and resources focusing on moderates instead of the base? Is that roughly what you're saying?
Absolutely. So I'll give you another example. Karl Rove is the person who educated me on this. We used to have this fun breakfast set up in the White House in the West Wing, where if you didn't have a breakfast date you could just go to the general table and just sit, whoever was there happened to be there. And one day I went down there and Karl Rove was there. I sat right next to him. I heard him talking about it. I asked him a few questions. And one of the points he made that really rang out to me was, he said, another problem with appealing to people who are in the middle, call them independents or moderates or whatever you want to call them, the problem is their belief system on issues is usually very eclectic and unpredictable. And it's not necessarily moderate on every issue. Some of these independents are like really conservative on abortion, and then they're really liberal on environment or something. So if you try to appeal to these voters through ads and through direct mail and everything, it's hard to have a consistent appeal to them that's not going to turn around and offend your base. So this is another reason why Rove was a great advocate of spending your campaign resources on your base and energizing them and getting them to vote, because it's very hard to appeal to people who don't have a coherent issue belief system and who are kind of all over the place on what they believe.
Wow. That makes a lot of sense. So moderates and independents, they don't have consistency across all the different issues. They may have a collection of even contradictory conservative and liberal opinions inside their mind. I've heard that from many people who study this, is that voters will have contradictory opinions if they're not modified or encouraged by a party to have a cohesive opinion. If you leave it up to the individual person, they could have just a wide variety of opinions that contradict with each other simply because that's just how they feel. They never really thought about it. And when they go to the voting booth, they just go off how they feel.
Yep. So anyway, it's hard to use your campaign money efficiently and gather moderate and independent voters.
The last solution category is reward balanced media coverage. The crossfire phenomenon has had a considerable influence on how issues are being framed, and switch from strident argument to measured debate might have an impact on both viewer expectations, the quality of information presented. One way to accomplish this is by creating a dynamic in our culture that rewards accurate and balanced news. For example, one can envision a rating system developed by think tanks and funded by philanthropists that scores each network on the quality and objectivity of its coverage. Another idea is invest in civic education so that American school children are taught to respect two sides of an argument. What are these solutions, and what are the potential pitfalls, Professor?
Well, I'll start with an anecdote. My mother's 95, still doing well. You look at her, you think she's 75. My father passed away several months ago at the age of 95.
Wow.
They lived down in Florida, and I would go down and visit them. I walk into the condo, television is on. Television is always on at their house, virtually 24 hours a day. What's on? Fox News. Then we go down the elevator, and they have a friend who's early 90s, and she has the television going on there, but it's CNBC or I forget exactly what. That's all. So it's this problem where you've got the segmentation of the media, and people listen to the kinds of news that's comforting and reinforcing of their general orientation and value system to start with, and that it reinforces that. When I was a young boy, there were only 3 networks. I mean, there was NBC, BBC, and CBS, and they were all trying to get the same people. It was totally different.
Right.
So I think the media is a big part of this issue, but it's not so obvious how you tweak that system, because you've got owners and money around these different fragmentations. And it's not obvious who has the big checkbook that's going to be willing to make the kind of investment you would need to have a serious alternative balanced media, for example. At least that's not obvious to me who that is. There are some nice, modest little things that are going on that I like. Washington Post has this little fact check thing where they take at various times they'll take a statement their politician makes, and then they'll do a little research and do a little, hey, was this factual or not? Sure. And it's definitely true, probably true, whatever it is, that sort of thing. I think things like that they're constructive. Their impact is probably very modest, but I think things in that direction need to happen.
We had the Biden administration under Joe Biden tried to come out with a Ministry of Truth, or somebody who would basically be a czar over making sure fake news didn't go out there. And after they announced her, I think it was Nina Jankowicz was her name. They announced her, people started coming up with tweets that she had written promoting misinformation that she never took down. What chance do we have to have a true, fairest, unbiased national fact checker when the President of America and the White House itself tried to roll this out and they couldn't even guarantee it?
Yeah, I don't think we can expect that solution of this problem is going to come from initiatives from leading politicians on the left or the right. It has to come from the media. And then it has to have a constituency and a funding and a donor base that is going to sustain it and let it compete against. Because remember, a lot of the reason that people like these more charged kinds of media outlets is they're kind of fun and they're entertainment.
Yeah.
It's not education, it's entertainment. And they kind of get into it. So you have to be able to do what we're talking about, but also keep it interesting and fun and entertaining. It's a big challenge.
I remember Crossfire as a boy. Yeah. How possible is it that these corporations are out to make money and they all say fair and balanced? America's most trusted news, right? Their whole thing is, you and I both know that MSNBC paints a particular picture and gives information based upon that. But Fox News does the same thing, but their viewers don't know that. So, for example, my stepmom watches MSNBC and CNN all the time, whereas my stepdad watches Newsmax and Fox exclusively. Both of their networks tell you honest information. You know, we're giving it to you straight. The other guys are liars. How possible is it that we could have a rating system out there that would be accepted by the American people that would say, you know, Fox, you weren't as fair today, and CNN was a little bit more fair? I could see these corporations saying, you can't say how fair we are because that hurts our ability to market to our customers. Or we're going to fight that every step of the way because we don't want anybody saying conclusively that we're not accurate. I find both MSNBC and Fox to be inaccurate on a good amount of information. How would we do that? Is it possible to get corporations to bow to some sort of universal gatekeeper and accept whatever rankings they give? Or would they fight that because it affects their bottom line?
I think they'd probably fight it, but let me give you an analogy that shows the pitfalls. You know, the American Bar Association used to be a respected body that would provide evaluations of the qualifications of nominees to the Supreme Court or to the lower courts. And it got to the point where the conservatives were so suspicious of the American Bar Association that basically they developed their own organizations to do their own evaluations.
Right. The Federalist Society, I think.
For example, the Federalist Society.
Right.
And now it's gotten to the point, if you're a Republican and the person gets a good rating from the ABA, but a bad rating from the Federalist Society, it doesn't matter whether they're nominated by a Republican or Democrat, they're going to be suspicious of them.
Right.
So these, it's hard to imagine a sustainable, objective rating system, whether it be on media or on nominees, that can withstand the powerful polarization forces that are the underlying cause of these problems. And this is what I mean by there is no simple little tweak or fix that's going to solve this problem.
That was why I wanted to cover the solutions, was that I've seen a lot of reporting in the news and by politicians and by some professors who say the opposite. Oh, if we just did media reform, if we just got rid of social media, if we just got rid of gerrymandering, if we just got rid of primaries, you know, everything snaps back into place. And to hear from you, hey, I've looked at the solutions. There's reasons why all of these may not work. I mean, maybe they will, but there's also good reasons to believe that you'll have problems getting more centrists in Congress, that you'll have problems creating more deliberative process in Congress, increasing citizen participation, and having more balanced news coverage. And it was good to have a conversation with you because you were able to say, here's what we can potentially do, but here's also reasons why it may not work. I don't see many people in this discussion space acknowledging that. What I see is a lot of professors going, aha, I found the solution, it's this. And they may debate with each other, disagree with each other on the solution, but they seem to have this attitude of, if we just did this one thing, it would happen. And when I read your material, I was getting an impression of, like what you said, there are options, there are promising things we could do, but there's also reason to believe there's not going to be a magic bullet. It's not going to be easy. No one solution you can count on, and reasons why none of them may work anyways. Why is that opinion that I found in your report, in my opinion, so rare? Why do we have so many people saying, here's the solution, it's going to work? And yet in your report, I found somebody saying, here's the solutions, and maybe they could work, but here's reasons why they're not. I just don't seem to see people having this honest conversation about the pitfalls of how our magic solutions may not work at all.
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of people are frustrated with the polarization, and they're just looking for anything that is directionally helpful. In fairness to those people, they're just really frustrated with the condition of our politics today, and they're thinking we should try anything we can. And maybe they even overstate a little bit how effective some of these measures would be in the interest of trying to get some kind of innovation that moves us into a different direction. But I think you're right. I think there's too much. I think it's kind of naive idealism to a certain extent. People who really believe that they don't really appreciate how deep the problem is in terms of its underlying sociological, economic, and political causes. So they really think you can overwhelm those things with these little tweaks. And I just don't think that's realistic.
That is the conclusion that I've come to. Interviewing a lot of professors, I've seen all the different solutions, but I found that for every solution, there was another reason to believe it may not be the right one. For example, gerrymandering. Everybody's out there saying fix gerrymandering. Politicians, professors, news reporters, smart people, journalists, New York Times, Washington Post. And then you bring up, yeah, but the Senate can't be gerrymandered, and it was polarized too. Maybe gerrymandering won't work. I don't see them bringing that up. I just see them bringing up, here's gerrymandering the problem, and here's why we think it could work. And they're not really talking about the pitfalls to some of these solutions. And I find that to be misinforming the public, making them think this is an easy problem to fix. If we just had one bill to get rid of social media, it'll go away. And what I'm finding is it's a lot like what you said. This is a society problem, and it has been developed over decades. And it will take a long time and millions of people participating to actually undo it. And yet when I read the New York Times and Washington Post talking about polarization, there's, in my opinion, almost no mention of sorting, and that it goes on from the 1990s, and that it's indelible, and that it might be really hard to undo. And
the previous bouts of polarization, they didn't necessarily get solved by intentional actions of key players. In one case, it was simply World War II.
That's a good point.
I mean, World War II forced the country to come together because we had to deal with Hitler and the Japanese. So, and then sometimes it works out of its system. So through the 1950s, there was still, at least in domestic policy, there was still a good bit of bipartisan activity even after World War II. So it's important to realize that we won't necessarily get out of this thing just by pressing certain buttons. External events will induce the country to have to come out of it.
Okay. Thank you. You've been fascinating. I really appreciate this. Okay, winding down. If we do nothing to fix political polarization and we don't implement any of the ideas you suggested or any of the ideas anybody else suggested, will it just get better on its own and people just calm down? Or is this something we could expect to continue to fester into the future?
Oh, it will definitely fester into the future, but I think you're going to find presidents have an enormous stake in developing their legacy as somebody who was effective and did something for the country. I think they're going to get more creative at tackling these issues. They're going to get more creative in ways that aren't obvious to you and me today. So I think that's where the end is going to come from.
Future presidents.
Get things done. They don't want to just go into the White House and just do media press releases and everything, and then speak to their base for 4 years and then not get anything accomplished. So I don't know where it's going to go, but my prediction is a new type of presidential candidate will eventually get into the Oval Office, and they will change this dynamic.
That's interesting.
It won't be Donald Trump. It won't be Joe Biden, but it's going to be somebody else, and it may not be this time. May not be next time. Maybe 3 elections from now.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because I found Trump was a polarizing figure, in my opinion. However, I also found Biden to be a polarizing figure. And I've gotten into many debates with people where I said, when Joe Biden went on television at night with a blood red backdrop and 2 active duty Marines and seemed to call out 60 million Americans as enemies of the state, no, I don't think that was good for cohesion. That was not. It, in fact, scared moderates and Democrats. And he did that. And he wasn't criticized for that. And I'm like, okay, well, that's 2 presidents in a row kind of calling the other out. We also have examples of Trump wouldn't visit certain liberal states and he wouldn't send money there. But then the question was, okay, well, what about Palestine, Ohio? Biden would not visit it at all. Why? They never voted for him. Now, he didn't say that's why, but Trump didn't also say, I'm going to make sure to punish states who didn't vote for me. But it seems to be a pattern of two presidents in a row saying, if you didn't vote for me, I really don't want to do anything for you. And I'm going to go ahead and call out the other half as basically the worst kind of people ever. That's horribly destructive. You believe that we might have future presidents, maybe not this next election, but in the future, who will recognize that's bad behavior and not to engage in it on both the Republican and Democrat side?
Well, it may be a view that it's bad behavior. I doubt they'll be that Catholic.
Thank you.
I think what they're more likely going to do is they're going to say, I actually want to get more legislation done. I've got an agenda that I want to get accomplished, and I can't get there with this setup.
Fair enough.
And so I work on this in a different way, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know what they're going to do. If I knew it, I would tell you. But I think that's where the innovation is going to come from.
Okay. Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person. They've been listening to this interview. Wow, did they learn a lot? Some shocking information. But they're struggling to remember it. A lot of good material. They're struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing the professor guest said, and it's 5 days after they finished watching this interview. And while they struggle to remember everything, they cannot forget the one thing that you said about polarization. What is that one thought you want people to not be able to forget 5 days from now?
Well, if we get rid of the filibuster, we may get ping-ponging in Congress like we have it with the executive right now.
Ping-ponging is the academic term.
I guess. I don't know.
I'm just having fun. Sorry. I'm just having fun. Last question. You don't have to answer. We always ask. You don't have to answer. I'm going to send you a copy of the video in a little bit. If you know anybody who's willing to be part of an honest conversation on polarization, I hope you found this was a fair interview. We didn't do gotcha journalism. We just tried to understand. If you know anybody else, we always like recommendations, but you don't have to name anybody.
I'll give that some thought. Send you a little email with any good ideas I come up with.
I really appreciate that. We'll end it there. I'll send you a copy of the video shortly. And I want to say thank you for your time, Professor. Thank you for doing this report. And thank you for having original conclusions. I really enjoyed that.
All right. Good luck to you.
All right. Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.